Dr. Harinda Bidanage and dear participants, good afternoon and Happy New Year 2021. Welcome to NICE webinar on external and internal security challenges of Sri Lanka. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Neighborhood Studies is one of our major research centers here at NICE, and we do not limit ourselves to our immediate neighbor and big neighbors India and China, but also focus on Bangladesh, Bhutan, Afghanistan, Maldives, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. We have been organizing at least one webinar on Sri Lanka every month, and we wish to continue with it. To talk on interesting topic for today, we have invited Dr. Harinda Vidanage, who is the head at the Department of Strategic Studies, Sir John Kotelawala Defence University, Sri Lanka. Dr. Harinda Vidanage was formerly director, Bandaranaike Center for International Studies. Prior to his assignment at the BIS, he was an assistant professor of international relations at St. Lawrence University in New York from 2012 to 2016. He taught course on international relations, global governance, international security, technology and warfare, and global implications of cyber politics. He specializes in the area of international security and cyber politics. Dr. Bidanage graduated from University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, with first class honor of political science. He gained his PhD from University of Edinburgh, United Kingdom in 2009. Among his scholarly and academic achievements are the Senior Fulbright Award of Scholar in Residence 2011, the prestigious Overseas Research Fellowship awarded by the British government in 2005, the Principal Scholarship awarded by University of Edinburgh in 2005. He was the academic director at Bandaranaike Center for International Studies from 2009 to 2011. His professional experience include appointment as advisor, international affairs to the Sri Lankan president 2006 to 2010, and the role of consultant to the Sri Lankan Prime Minister during 2004-2005 on international affairs. Dr. Bidanage serves as visiting lecturer, MPhil PhD program at Faculty of Graduate Studies, University of Colombo, Master in International Relations program at University of Colombo. Dr. Bidanage has presented on various local and international academic and corporate forums on themes ranging from cybersecurity, international security, and geopolitics. He is frequently consulted by the Sri Lankan Army and Air Force for the academic advancement and international security related programs. Dr. Bidanage contributes regularly on electronic and print media, analyzing current global political development. He is the author of the bi-weekly international affairs column, a stat site, on the Sri Lankan daily newspaper, the Daily Mirror. We once again welcome Dr. Bidanage to our program. Dr. Bidanage, you can make your initial remark in 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. We request all our participants to drop their questions on the Facebook or in Zoom chat box. Please feel free to share our live video on our social media. Dr. Bidanage, the floor is yours. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. It's the first time I've been invited by NICE Nepal, and it's been a long time since I spoke on a Nepali forum. My last engagement in Nepal was, I think, 2004 in Kathmandu. So it's been a long time, and so I'm quite grateful to Dr. Pramod Jaiswal. And I had seen the wonderful work he does at the institution, and you have, I think, the audience, the researchers, the students, everybody gets quite a 360 from global scholars and policymakers. And as he said, it's also I'm quite happy to represent Sri Lanka and give a perspective of Sri Lanka, which also is an important part of the puzzle at the moment, the geopolitical puzzle, as well as the larger security puzzle in global politics. So what I'm going to do is, since it's a very broad and open topic, it's about internal and external challenges to Sri Lanka's security. What I thought was I'll try to, the first half of the talk, I'll try to kind of guide you through a chronological analysis and a comparison between internal developments and external developments. So what I thought was rather than going back to like ancient times, to stick to very contemporary moment. And I think the last decade is the most important for the contemporary debate. So that is basically Sri Lanka's post-war turning point, which is 2009. I think most Sri Lanka, enthusiasts on Sri Lanka, as well as general knowledge that Sri Lanka went through a three-decade conflict, and which ended with a military defeat of the Tamil Tiger terrorists, Tamil Tigers, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Nadu, one of the world's ruthless terror organizations, with their defeat in 2009. The violence, the war ended. And I probably wanted to look at 2009 onwards. So basically, I'm looking at transformations that happened within Sri Lanka in that particular time period, as well as what happened external to the country, regionally and globally, and how the region, the local and the global interacted, as well as how that kind of impacted Sri Lanka's views about security, as well as how it also challenged Sri Lanka. I mean, we're looking at challenges as a relatively small nation, not a very small state. I think number 76 in the small index, so you're not very small, but at least geographically. But in the context of power disposition, we're still seen as a small state, and of course a state which is strategically important in many ways to many actors and parties externally. So 2009, if you take it, so I'm looking at a decade, 2009, 2019. Then, of course, I will discuss about events of 2019 and 2020, which are quite crucial, I think, in the puzzle in understanding Sri Lanka's security, compulsions, as well as what influenced Sri Lanka's security decision making during that particular period. But I think the first decade, 2009, 2019, out of that, I probably want to focus on 2009, 2014 as the first half of that particular decade, and 2014 and 2019 as the second half of that particular decade, because both has serious connotations, as well as there were divergences in approaches, as well as there were so many you can actually even compare between those two half decades, locally as well as globally. So 2009, after the defeat of the LTTE, I think the priority of the Sri Lankan government then was to embark on a rebuilding, reconstruction, as well as a reconciliation drive, because the government was challenged in many ways. One, the government had to politically, these are political challenges. Politically, the government had to demonstrate that it could provide people with tangible benefits of a post-war situation, which means the country had, a country with a lot of potential, where a lot of people, analysts globally, have identified Sri Lanka as kind of this wonder nation in South Asia that could have gone, so far ahead, but it always was bogged down by this, the three-decade conflict. So the government was quite anxious and was quite excited at the same time to get Sri Lanka back on its feet, and as well as to kind of deliver tangible outcomes of a post-war dividend to everyone. And of course, that meant it had to do serious reconstruction, rebuilding, as well as serious approach to reconciliation, because globally and locally, it was also believed that though the violence ended, the war ended, the LTTE was defeated, you have any post-conflict societies needs healing, and healing is one of the most difficult things in post-conflict societies. And you can see in many countries, many societies, this is still a challenge in any form of a conflict, ethnic, ideological, or even interested. So in that context, that was a threefold challenge Sri Lanka had, right? And so if you look at the parallel developments of the region and the world, it was a very interesting time. 2008, the world was just coming out from the West financial crisis. So 2008, from a global political perspective, was a turning point for many countries, because and it's a turning point in when you chronicle the evolution of the global order. And many analysts identify 2008 as a turning point because of it was, it's seen as a time when the primacy of US presence, the primacy of the US agenda, the so-called geopolitical Western agenda being to a certain extent harmed, to a certain extent, weakening. It's like not the end point, but a beginning of a certain weakening, beginning of a rupture. And it was very clear that the West, in certain ways, was struggling, and it was being felt globally. And at the same time, this was a parallel time when you saw the rise. I mean, of course, the presence of China, and China slowly, showing its interest, support, and interest in engaging with the world. Not as much as it is doing now, but it was gradually, becoming a key player. And if it place Sri Lanka in the middle of all of that, this was a time when uh, China, if you look at Sri Lanka's last 3-4 years of the war, Sri Lanka was militarily heavily supported by Chinese arms and armaments, which kept on flowing. Of course, we had serious support from India, United States, and sometimes, in different ways, from intelligence and all these things. So Sri Lanka's last push, we were supported by many sides, but China was a significant, part of it, because of the constant flow of arms and armaments that was actually needed on the ground to keep the war effort going. I mean, I don't want to go into much in the details, because most of Sri Lanka analysts knows this, right? So, of course, when Sri Lanka was, looking at its own rebuilding, reconstruction, we were caught in this particular, situation, right? We wanted to rebuild, we needed support, and of course, this is a time when the West was suddenly reeling and shaking from a serious financial, crisis, and that's probably one of the reasons why Sri Lanka's, that particular government's development drive had serious, support, and see, the government had to kind of look at China for some of that, reconstruction, rebuilding, and I think that deepened and widened China's, interest and involvement in Sri Lanka. But I think it did not dampen, for example, Sri Lanka-India relations. But it's a point, it's a turning point in how Sri Lanka looked at the post-war region, the world, and obviously China, Sri Lanka kind of, met a very reliable partner in its this whole development and reconstruction drive. Um, and if you look at the next 4-5 years onwards, you can see how Sri Lanka's relations with China kind of, was a key factor. And also it showed a bit of a dampening of relations as you moved on with countries like India. And 2013-14 was a bit of a turning point, where you clearly saw there was an increasing, concern from Indian side with China's presence, as well as there was a particular incident where there was a incident where the birthing of two Chinese, the story of birthing of two Chinese submarines, which really irked the Indian side, actually, which really took that particular Sri Lanka-India relations to a bit of a low ebb. And within that backdrop, you saw even in Sri Lankan domestic political transformations, right? Sri Lanka's domestic political transformations was pretty much driven by a very interestingly popular government at point of 2009, to a certain extent losing its steam and losing its way. And by 2014, in middle of 2014, there was a clear sign that there was a lot of opposition within Sri Lanka's political system, political parties coming towards that particular government of President Mahinda Rajapaksa at that time. So things very quickly changed in Sri Lanka in that particular few years, as well as and what I'm trying to tell you here is, all of you, if you look at 2009 to 2014, so our security concerns, if you look at it, was more trumped by were mainly kind of development reconstruction, as well as there was interest to prevent resurgence of separatism. But it was the key construction, rebuilding, reconciliation. These were the kind of security dynamics that kind of drove Sri Lanka's agenda. And if you look at, and parallel to that, two more things I need to mention. By 2010, the United States had President Obama, I remember, announcing first the pivot to Asia policy, which was quickly rechristened as rebalancing to Asia, and then of course the beginning of America's the serious interest in the Indian Ocean region, and America's rebalancing policy, which brought U.S. Economic, financial, strategic interest very much into our side of the world, basically the so-called super region of Asia Pacific. So there was a clear, so that is another point that we need to kind of keep in mind, parallel to our own timeline, the US announcing its pivot to Asia in 2010. And a few years, a couple of years on, China's gets a new general secretary for its Communist Party, and then by 2013 you get Xi Jinping as the president of China, and a very different, very new, not very new, but very poignant, very assertive worldview that Chinese leaders have not demonstrated before coming out. And clearly the renunciation of China's interest will go beyond its region to establish linkages, to establish the belt, the so-called One Belt, One Road, which was the first iteration of the BRI, and announcing of that. And by 2014, India also got a new prime minister. Again, which broke the Nehru, and that prime minister was very clear that, when Prime Minister Modi came to power, it was very clear that the Nehru-Gandhian global view has gone. And Modi has managed to shatter the Nehru-Gandhian view that many Indian leaders kind of stuck to, even though you were in the Congress or not. So if you're looking at Sri Lanka within all these contexts, so you can see how Sri Lanka would have been affected. So within a span of 3, 4, 5 years after the end of Sri Lanka's conflict, we see a rise of a very different region, a very different regional orientation, as well as a very interestingly developing global set of relations, especially between the United States and China, and then later on that having a major impact on the rest of the world. So that is why when we look back now and look at what were our security imperatives, security policies, I mean, to be fair to the policymakers in this small country, it was very, very challenging to forge a set of, security priorities, because it was getting pretty turbulent. But and of course, and Sri Lanka internally was going through serious change, political change. And then I moved on to the more important the second half of the decade, the second half of the decade, 2015 to 2019, right? So by end of 2014, a presidential election is announced. The presidential election is fast forwarded. It's advanced by a couple of years, and then you see the emergence of what you call the good governance kind of slogan, a new political force, which is a combination of the two old arch enemies in Sri Lankan political history. Sri Lanka's politics, if you look at the modern political system, ever since independence, There were two major political parties. One was was a right wing, the other one was more left of center. Two parties, the United National Party and the SLFP, the Sri Lankan Freedom Party, they were the kind of, who shared power between them, either individually or mostly in minor or major coalitions. So uh, the 2015 was an interesting turning point. Both these parties kind of get together, and the presidential candidate is from the SLFP, the same party as President Rajapaksa was, and his general secretary break ranks, and goes into a coalition with the United National Party, and the prime ministerial candidate was Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe. So suddenly in 2015, Sri Lanka sees a very new political landscape, the so-called good governance, a kind of a coalition government, like cohabitation government. Some people can be, and from the two exact opposites of the political coin, so to political spectrum. So there was a lot of, I think rather more than in Sri Lanka, regionally and globally, especially from the Western bloc, geopolitical bloc. When I say geopolitical bloc, the kind of the North America, Western Europe, India, Japan, Australia, the so-called geopolitical Western bloc was very optimistic about this new government, and there was a lot of support for this new government. I actually ideologically as well as morally, but tangibly we do. That's a bit of a question mark. So a new political formation, and there was a lot of interest thinking that this government would soon change the course of Sri Lanka's foreign policy, as well as take certain decisions on Sri Lanka's domestic, machinery, such as democratic systems, reforms in the parliament, reforms of bribery and corruption, all these things. Very progressive, very liberal, idealistic viewpoints. But what you saw in that particular half decade was a story of serious disappointment for most Sri Lankans, as well as probably the stakeholders or the countries which actually were interested in supporting this coalition. The coalition, I feel, had one fundamental, I think, weakness, contradiction. It was a fun because when you bring together two parties which has tried this before in minute ways and have already failed, and two very different personalities as the president and the prime minister, right? Who has no real, so this particular mix came at a very interesting time in the regional and global politics. So 2015 to 2019, if you look at regionally and globally, again, you see the intensification of rivalries and competitions. And clearly 2015 onwards, you clearly see Indian Ocean region becoming seriously towards militarized. And you clearly see, and also by between particularly that particular decade, you see a very interesting shift. The serious strengthening of US-India relations was a critical point. If you look at between President Obama and President Trump, there were so many divergences. But I think one point of convergence in the US foreign policy when it came to Indian Ocean was the fact that it was its relationship with India, and the relationship strengthened so much. And at the same time, the US was also interested in establishing, deepening and widening its relations with Sri Lanka. But and also, China. But the point was, the Sri Lankan government, that particular coalition, also realized, though it came on this moral ground of good governance, it still needed, serious financial support. The country was economically not doing great, and it still heavily relied on support coming from countries like China. And the internal contradiction of Sri Lankan, that particular governance regime, didn't help at all to articulate a clear national security, direction. And if you, one of the, I mean, I'm not criticizing, but if you look at 2015 to 2019, whatever the serious security discussions that took place in Sri Lanka, most were actually about maritime security, which is very important, and also about Indian Ocean security. And Sri Lanka started, really getting involved in Indian Ocean related, forums, and Sri Lanka was also trying to have, host its own Indian Ocean forum. What I'm trying to tell you is, I feel this particular focus on Indian Ocean, which is in a way not purely our own interest of security, it is also an interest driven by India, United States. So what you saw was our security priorities were very much aligned to external compulsions, right? To a certain extent, I think that that could have been done, but it came as a compromise. It came as our own internal security priorities seems to have kind of lapsed. So there was a serious lack of say intelligence integration, serious lapse of modernizing the Sri Lankan military. And the constant bickering between the two parties and the two officers of the presidency and the prime minister never helped. So within a span of 4 to 5 years, there was a serious degeneration of relations within the government, which led to an implosion. So 2019, for me, I'm just accelerating a this little bit because I think I have only about 40 minutes. 2019 was a bit of a crucial year in Sri Lanka, because 2019 brought us to face a lot of realities of this failure of good governance, right? The clear turning point was, Sri Lanka faced dual shocks in 2019 and 2020. The first shock was the April 20 Easter Sunday attacks, right? I mean, I won't call it ISIS. I mean, ISIS affiliate, definitely extremism, radicalized group using multiple attacks. Probably one of the most largest multiple attacks of modern terror history. 8 locations, 8 targets, simultaneous attacks. And that's quite a feat. So what you see is a serious lapse of internal security, serious lapse of diplomacy, serious lapse of even taking serious what neighboring countries gave as intelligence warnings, and a serious lapse within the whole system of governance, where there was non-representation, where there was things were not taken seriously at the highest level. So which really made Sri Lanka pay a massive price. And also it came at a time when things were not going well in the region as well. Really, it was a time when things were very much changing globally. Global security landscape was there was a deterioration. The so-called geopolitical rivalries heating up, and in Sino-India relations were going down as well. And that particular decade, what I'm trying to give you a sense is how we kind of bungled a lot internally because of serious bad policy making, as well as externally because Sri Lanka we couldn't focus our resources as well as our foresight into trying to understand these massive turbulent times that was kind of hitting us one after the other. So many changes in that particular decade externally, that I mean, and because we didn't have a solid footing about our own government, so there was this kind of deep difficulty to align to security needs both internally and both externally, and we were sometimes pushed to certain agendas that didn't help us as well. So that's my chronological analysis of the kind of of what happened in the 2 years. But I also have a supplementary analysis. This particular chronological analysis you can other people also make sometimes, and I don't want to dwell a lot on the geopolitical and this whole India China US relations. There are so many analysts who has given a good a lot of points of view about that, but I want to make you some kind. I want to do a thought experiment. sorry, man. Like coming from, this applies not just to Sri Lanka, but most small states which are struggling with this kind of turbulence, given the the unfolding past struggles in their own regions and their neighborhoods, right? One thing that I'm a bit worried and very concerned about as a scholar, as a researcher, is the fact that we are becoming more and more, we are analyzing things more and more geopolitically. Of course, a realist would argue that's the reality. But the problem is the more you analyze and explain things geopolitically, geopolitics is a very deterministic, very narrow framework. So when you are so sucked into the, it's very seductive though. You can always say, look, there's India, there's China, that particular seduction, it seduces academics and researchers more than any others. You get really sucked into this whole equation, and what happens is you stop looking beyond that. You stop looking at the good things. You stop looking at the potentials of multilateralism, the potential of good relationship, the potential that there can be relations even between India, China, Sri Lanka that doesn't have to be rivalrous or competitive. There are so many other communities that can work together, even given this context of competition. So I'm sometimes a bit concerned as a Sri Lankan, because Sri Lanka is a country which is in a way caught into this, right? So we are right in the middle of it. There's no way we can change the situation. Number two is the fact that when you start looking at things from these deterministic points of view, another problem that is happening, as I see, is this whole institutionalization of competition, right? So we always knew there was competition, and of course the competitions grew because of, in a certain way, the American drawdown from global affairs. Of course it led to a massive vacuums globally for regional powers to start competing. But if you look at our own neighborhood, when we see security arrangements institutionalizing, say for example the Quad institutionalizing, for Sri Lankan point of view, I feel a bit concerned about it. More you institutionalize security arrangements, more you fix adversarial relations. More adversarial relations are fixed, serious trouble for countries like Sri Lanka. Because we are country, we are still struggling to articulate our national security policy. We're struggling. I mean, I'm not blaming any Sri Lankan policymaker, because we came out from, as you understand, the last 10 years, the situations we come out, we want to progress, we want to do things right, but but here, this is what we are going to be faced with. Of course we can have academic debates about, oh yeah, we can be independent, we can be non-aligned, but the operative practical necessity questions are not that. What we're seeing is a serious gelling, ossification of these things. So that kind of fixed adversarial arrangements, institutions are a big challenge for Sri Lanka's security. Because if we are going to make certain decisions, we see adversarial relations being fixed, that the rigidity would not help us. The other point, the point I want to think very different from normal international relations, geopolitical analysis, is something that I want to bring. It's a philosophical but very practical. When I was thinking even about this talk, and I'm teaching for my young students a course on war and technology, which I've been teaching even in the States. I designed a course on war and technology a few 7 years back. If you look at how technology has changed the security landscape in our region, right? This is why I said the problem for small states. If you look at the investment and the technological development, so for me, it's like this. Look, it's like for Sri Lanka being stuck between a supersonic BrahMos missile and a hypersonic YA-18 of the PLA. Right? We see the most advanced, there is a serious investment. Countries, the modernization of militaries across the region are astronomical. So though we in Sri Lanka, we are trying to say we can manage this, we can navigate this diplomatically. When I just see the capabilities that have been developing, this for me reminds of for students. I don't know, some of you might like this. Paul Virilio, the French philosopher, in 1997, if I recall right, wrote a piece, which is a very, I love that piece, Speed and Politics. And that's where he brought his idea of dromology, where he said it's a speed that trumps everything. If you're, there's a speed that warfare, transformation of warfare brings. That's the real deal, right? And I think the the competition is speeding up, the technology is speeding up. Countries like Sri Lanka are slowing down, right? So there is a deep divergence there between the speed and capability of big powers and medium range powers, which are really pouring resources, and countries like Sri Lanka, even Nepal, even Maldives. We are. I mean, after a while, though, we talk about national security and all these things. We talk about maritime security. Look at the capabilities, surveillance capabilities. Look at the US-India relations. I mean, the latest iteration, the last deal which was stuck out of the four deals that agreements that were signed, the BECA. I mean, though it say the term is very harmless. It says I think basic exchange cooperation agreement. But what are you exchanging? You get serious classified information, you get aeronautical, topological, it basically shares a lot of sensitive data that can really make, things really hard for countries. So for example, Indian missiles will be so accurate, there is already interoperability between strategic communication between the allies. So what I'm trying to tell you is this: I'm very concerned about this change of pace. We have looked at geopolitics, we have looked at geoeconomics, of course, we have looked at geotechnology. But I'm thinking this whole idea, I'm just floating an idea. This is open for competition, contention, even criticism from the listeners. But I'm just trying to tell you from a state like Sri Lanka, which is trying to deal with so many things. Of course, we are worried about radicalization. Of course, we are worried about an increasing, rivalry between India and China, and of course, US, Australia. So there is a serious militarization. But I'm speaking beyond the militarization. The militarization will always lead to the ultimate, which is the weaponization. So when we have a region which is militarized and weaponized at a certain level, the poverty of technological advancements, to what extent can we modernize? To what extent can we protect our actual maritime domains? To what extent can we do surveillance right? Will anything we do, right, out of our national interests? What is our kind of level of privilege, preservation of our data, our resources? So I think one major development in this particular scenario, you guys must be thinking this guy is pretending that COVID is not existing, but I'm trying to bring you another dimension, the idea of speed. Even for young researchers, students, this is the kind of a thing. Even for very senior researchers, I think this is very interesting. I mean, for me, it has interested me again, the speed of transformation. We've been talking about speed of technology, but if you look at from a pure defensive, if you're defense oriented, thinking the speed is something for me. I'm terrified, right? So I thought I'll leave you with this kind of thinking, but just to sum up, because I want to stick to the 30-40 minute timeline that Dr. Jaiswal gave me. But what can Sri Lanka do? Of course, Sri Lanka, there is this general criticism in the country. Even sometimes I used to say this, but I kind of toned down. We always keep saying Sri Lanka doesn't have a national security policy, neither does it have a national security strategy. But more and more, if you look at things, we realize, given this rate of transformations and the multiple challenges, I mean, even the countries which had the best national security strategies, right, and the big frameworks are failing miserably again. A natural security strategy, security challenge that came as in the form of COVID-19. So it's not just having a robust strategy. I think it's having a robust set of pillars that you can work around, pillars of national security that should be brought up. If you try to keep framing national security strategies at this moment, like countries like Sri Lanka, I think it's a challenge. What Sri Lanka needs, I feel, is a strong set of agreed set of pillars that we will then work around. But probably we need more is a national defense strategy, which is doable. Because this is coming from my observation about the speed and stuff like that. What we seriously need from the experiences also of the Easter Sunday attacks is the fact that our defense policy should be really unified. There has to be serious unification of certain commands, serious diversifications, boosting of military intelligence, boosting of cyber command, boosting of maritime domain awareness capabilities, surveillance. So I think, and modernization of Sri Lanka's military, I think that's something we really need to do. And if service people are joining, I think that's the area we really need to kind of catch up with. So a flexible but under workable set of pillars of national security, focusing on a set of pillars, a framework, rather than like a clear-cut, robust strategy, but a more flexible set of pillars that we can then build on those, and a robust national defense strategy. That I think is kind of a way forward for Sri Lanka's security. There is so many other things we could have discussed, but I think I don't want to get in the way of the questions. So I will stop there. And I think there are already questions coming in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vidanage, for the interesting and comprehensive presentation. You have touched upon all the major security issues. I'm sure our participants benefited from it. We have received a huge number of questions, so let me raise the questions without wasting much time. The first question is, how is Sri Lanka dealing with terrorism issues after the Easter bombing? What should Sri Lanka do to improve its security, avoiding a terrorist attack? And I'm trying to club one more question. How can India and Sri Lanka work together in countering terrorism?
Yeah, I think these are all like interrelated, very important. I think these are the things we are grappling with. I think these are the things that we were grappling with and then got really hit by COVID-19. So of course, one of the areas when East Sunday attacks took place, if you look back, of course, the first the kind of focus was, if you look from a policy, from a political thing, there was a lot of finger pointing which went up to the presidency and the prime minister as well. But if you look from the operative aspect of it, the challenges was serious drawbacks in how the interagency operations, as well as the non-integrated approach that the intelligence services had, and non-inclusion of critical intelligence arms of the services in Security Council, stuff like that. So I think Sri Lanka quickly, I think the present government has quickly addressed that. They have seriously revamped the intelligence services, and the way intelligent integration, the interagency operations has been really ramped up. But then it's not sufficient, because if you look at the demography of these attackers, none of these guys were from they're from backward or underprivileged. Most of them were from very privileged urban locations, which was very puzzling. And most of them had been overseas, so they were not your average radical. You won't see them as an average radical. So, and most of them had traveled as students, as businesses, and also, and then we have realized some of them were also part of, they were actively fighting in theaters in Syria. I think this was the challenge. This was the challenge most countries, even Western countries, had when ISIS was in full flow. Most of these fighters who came to Syria and Iraq were actually foreign fighters. So there was this massive circulation of foreign fighters in and out. And of course, from South Asia also, there were certain numbers. And I think Maldives probably was the highest per capita of fighters that went from South Asia. But I mean, Sri Lankans were oblivious. We didn't even kind of imagine Sri Lankans would be fighting. But I think that's the problem. The border management system needs serious revamping. We don't have a national database. I mean, so we really needed to fix lax border management that had to be fixed. Otherwise, because being an island, we always boast about our location. Island also is a strategic. It's a minefield. You have to protect so much of coastlines. The whole country is opened up. So it's very difficult to I think border protection and border management has to be taken up seriously. I think they're addressing it, but I frankly think what happened after a year in COVID-19 has also taken a lot of resources, because at the moment Sri Lanka's military and law enforcement is the front line against COVID-19 as well. So which is also an asset to us, but it is also if you from a security strategic perspective, we are putting it's a risk for our own frontline people. So it's a bit of a diversification of resources has to be thought of in the future. So Sri Lanka, I think, to answer those first two questions, it's very clear that we have tried to address this by trying to fix our intelligence failures. That is the primary thing. And I think we have and also the last 5 years, national security from that perspective was not very much a priority. So the government change has brought in back a resurgence of, this is a contentious point. Some people don't like serious national security states, but I think the national security state is back strongly than before. So that because of that, there is serious focus on tackling terrorism. The third question was about Sri Lanka-India relations. In the context, Pramod, can you just remind me the last? It was about
like how India and Sri Lanka can work together in countering terrorism.
Of course, Sri Lanka and India. There was so much of India was a prime provider of sensitive information. India has provided us so much of, when it comes to intelligence, interoperations and intelligence sharing. India has been in the forefront. So I think Sri Lanka will, of course, rely and will need that support. And because India is also developing its capabilities to do surveillance, it's investing a lot in surveillance capabilities. It's enhancing its intelligence agencies. It's providing a lot of resources. I think Sri Lanka will benefit a lot, and India is, and of course, if you saw, even Mr. Ajit Doval was in Sri Lanka in November. So I think India is showing a lot of interest in Sri Lanka. So I think it always remained a pillar, and it will be a crucial relationship that we need to foster and harness for responding to terrorism, not just countering. Countering is a tactical thing, and also then countering terrorism. Okay.
Let me move to the next question. What foreign policy strategy will Sri Lanka adopt in engaging India and China to ensure neutrality in the Indian Ocean? Sri Lanka is at an important geopolitical location in the Indian Ocean. How can Sri Lanka capitalize its strategic location in Indian Ocean region? I'm trying to club 2-3 questions.
Yeah. This is a perennial question, as well as it's a very frequent question, because what has happened in Sri Lanka is we have got our foreign policy questions have got a lot of academic answers. Academic answers are, you can say, well, we can manage, we can be neutral and all these things. But policy responses have to be more nuanced and have to be more pragmatic than the academic ones. I'm not trying to undermine the academic argument, being an academic myself, but I strongly believe that there has to be serious policy research, policy thinking, even amongst our academics. We can't live in bubbles. We can't afford to live in bubbles anymore, because we are facing with this harsh reality, that there is this, we have to deal with Sri Lanka, India and China, and then both these countries are, it's been a very bad, it's not been a great year for India-China relations last year, right? So imagine that, trying to deal with India and China at this particular point. So I think but both these countries, interestingly, it's not putting our strategic location as an advantage. That's a misconception and a bit of a myth. Strategy, everybody knows we are in a strategic location, right? It's so, the using, it's not that, but it's using the strategic ambitions of the two and working with it. See, China is not the China it was before. China is very sophisticated. China understands exactly where Sri Lanka is stuck. And China knows that we can never move forward if we make a serious misdealings with India, and if we really fall into the dark side of in India's opinions. So that would actually not benefit China. So China would not want to push Sri Lanka to a position that it will make it hard for Sri Lanka to kind of have good relations with India, because that is strategically disadvantageous for China. So we have to understand that reality as well. And also we have to understand another reality, which is China, which is India. India is very concerned about its neighborhood now. It's very clear. If you look at the past year, since the appointment of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, election victory of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, I had never seen personal visit, a quick visit within 48 hours by the foreign minister, right? Followed by invitation to come to India. Then there were so many high-level delegations of Indians coming to Indian administration coming to Sri Lanka. And then you had Ajit Doval coming to Sri Lanka. And then again, last week, we have the foreign minister Jaishankar coming again to Sri Lanka. So it's a very clear signal to Sri Lankan policymakers that India is making. If India wants to give us trouble, and another reality I need to tell everybody is March 2021. It's a Human Rights Council, and Sri Lanka is on the agenda. So the last thing you want is a bit of a breaking up or kind of going receding your relations with India. India has been very clear about its certain position stances. So, and in certain points, it seems the India and government may not look eye to eye on certain issues. But I don't think Sri Lanka would want to damage its relations with India. But at the same time, India also understands that it will push Sri Lanka. It will tell Sri Lanka. But I don't think it wants to take us to a brink, because it's again disadvantageous to India as well. Because India is very keen on it, and it's for India also. Sri Lanka is very important, and I think and that particular. So what we are trying to if we can, is to achieve some kind of strategic autonomy in relations by being frank and by engaging with these two powers. And also I think being frank is the most. I think this government is trying to do that a little bit. The president has been very frank to China. He recently told them, look, we don't need we are not in search of any more gifts or debt. We need serious investment. And I think he has been very open to India as well. Of course, managing that, as I told you, I can give you long academic answers, but it's at the moment, I would leave it here. It's a very big challenge, policy challenge, because the problem is not Sri Lanka. The problem is the relationship between India and China is not the best at the moment. So that is why I said earlier in my presentation also, that if we start fixing things, and if adversary relationships are fixed, it will make things very hard for Sri Lanka. I'm not very, I'm very concerned about it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'll move to next question. Like recently, Mike Pompeo visited Sri Lanka. There was a visit by Indian Foreign Minister, and Indian National Security Advisor participated in trilateral maritime meeting. Is Sri Lanka going to join the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Is Sri Lanka going to join
Indo-Pacific strategy of United States?
I mean, the strategy is the American strategy. It's not Sri Lanka's strategy. I think I don't think Sri Lanka needs to join a strategy. Sri Lanka needs to understand what the US strategy is. I think Sri Lanka is very clear in that particular. I think Sri Lanka is very aware of all the strategies. Sri Lanka is very aware of what the United States want. It's very aware about what India wants. It's very aware about what China wants. I think the last thing the Sri Lankans want is to be a stakeholder in any strategic formation or any strategic push because Sri Lanka virtually can't be part of the US. I mean, I don't think. I mean, that's the question is a bit problematic. I don't think any country wants to be part of another country's strategy. But I think it's the being aware of the interest, and of course also benefiting from that to a certain extent. I think to a certain extent, Sri Lanka has been open to the US. It did sign certain agreements. It has not. It has withdrawn from certain agreements that it was to sign. But certain, for example, we did not sign the VFA. We have gone out of MCC. But previous agreements we have signed, we have dealt with it. A lot of people forget. Pramod, it gives me a chance. I want to remind people, there was a Voice of America relay station in Sri Lanka till very recently. Right? Every government has facilitated that somehow. So we have managed. We have managed despite our internal differences. But the problem is the current reality is a bit too stark than too turbulent and challenging than the ones before. But I don't think Sri Lanka wants to be part of any other country's strategy. But it, of course, it understands the strategic postures and strategic interests. But Sri Lanka we are always, I think, primarily, we are all, I mean, we should be sensitive to the strategic interests of India, primarily in the region. But we also should not be, we should not pretend we are oblivious to other strategic interests in the region as well.
There are lots of questions on Indo-Pacific, in fact. Let me try to club them. What is Sri Lanka's stand on United States Indo-Pacific strategy? How has Sri Lanka committed towards Indian Ocean Rim Association and the Indian Ocean region building?
Oh, Sri Lanka is pretty much part of IORA. Sri Lanka we have had high-level meetings. Our delegations were there. Foreign Ministry is pretty much forefront of that. I mean, any form of multilateralism in the region, Sri Lanka has no issue. I think Sri Lanka is concerned. I think Sri Lanka should be concerned. I can't speak for the government. I'm not speaking. I'm just an independent academic. I can't speak for the state. Nor does my university that I represents any of those views. But what we are trying to say, as an academic, what I'm trying to say is that any form of multilateral engagement, we are very happy to be part of, and we have been part of that. And we even set up, I think, a few years back, Ocean Affairs Division within our Foreign Ministry. We have a strong presence in IORA. And we take part in a lot of BIMSTEC, conversations. Highest levels of ministerial delegations take part. So I think we are pretty much on board when it comes to regional mechanisms and exploring various forms of regional cooperation. That's why I'm saying that's a good thing, because that actually takes us beyond the geopolitical limits, or this is limited framework of trying to understand. And of course we also are part of we are in observer status of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We are very keen to be part of any form of mini or multilateralisms that is in the region or in the adjacent regions. But that doesn't mean the Indo-Pacific strategy. The Indo-Pacific strategy is pretty much the U.S. U.S. strategic focus on the region, and which is built on American strategic interests, and also to a certain extent it has its serious significant support coming from India, Australia, Japan. But that doesn't mean we have to be part of that. We are of course open to. I mean, we are not shutting down there is so much of an engagement, and the US, for example, as the bilateral relationship is not bad. We are doing so much of things together. There is constant US AID work projects being done in Sri Lanka. There is, though MCC was a decision, that doesn't mean that is the end of bilateral relations between US and Sri Lanka. The US have supported, even in the context of Sri Lanka's military modernization, we have got some ships, I think from Pacific Command, where there was one was transferred recently. Our newly come emerging Marine Corps is being trained, and we have always had US consultants, experts, throughout training Sri Lankan military, and we have had good dialogues on maritime security between and US counterparts, and there has been, even in the East attack bombings, the DOJ and the FBI was heavily involved. So I mean, there is no. I mean, there is no. I think we are the country is quite keen on US Sri Lanka relations, but that doesn't mean we have to be part of a strategic of a certain country in the neutrality still comes from the perennial, the original point of our foreign policy, which is non-alignment. Sri Lanka is one of the founding nations of non-alignment, and our most successful diplomatic engagements and diplomatic navigations triumphs has been because we were a non-aligned nation, as well as we were part of the non-aligned bloc. So if somebody is asking which bloc we are in, I think we are still in the non-aligned bloc. That is the most strategically advantageous bloc Sri Lanka could be at any given time. Of course, then somebody can ask, say, non-alignment is different from 20th century, 21st century. It may be. We may have economic alignments, but I think political non-alignment still is a key value in our foreign policy. I think that's so. If we are driven by, as a non-alignment state, driven by that ethos, we don't have to be part of a strategic container, and actually, which is very much counterproductive to our strategic interests and national security of the country.
Let me move to the next question. Like, you talk about MCC, so it's something related to it. How will Sri Lanka balance between United States Indo-Pacific strategy and China's Belt and Road Initiative? Recently, Sri Lanka did not approve Millennium Challenge Corporation (MCC). MCC is struggling to get it endorsed even in Nepalese parliament. How do you look at it?
Well, I think again, it's again the thinking. I mean, there is this very interesting thinking that is coming up. I mean, a lot of people have this. Even sometimes, even I also get, we all get sucked into it. This whole idea of balancing. I think that's a bit, it's a bit, it's not real. You can. It's not balancing. I think it's managing. You can reach certain levels of balances, but there is no way you can reach a certain level of a middle ground in when you have this kind of complex. Because what I want to tell you is, last 10 years, one thing that last 10 years have shown us, demonstrated to us, is that the world is a very complex place. It is driven by serious complexity. That is why I know a few years back, Schweller wrote that article on Foreign Affairs saying age of entropy. Of course, it's an age of entropy. So when you have so much of chaos and complexity, I mean, to think of balancing is not the most wise strategic approach. Strategically, you don't balance. Strategically, you manage things. Strategically, you make sure your interests, because at the end of it, it's for Sri Lanka, like any other country, it's our self-preservation, right? So sometimes when you try to balance, you are kind of, you're vulnerable from many sides. When you try to balance, it's the point of vulnerability, right? It's the point of vulnerability. So rather than that, I think management through engagement, right? So we cannot disengage. That's a fallacy I hope this government also doesn't get into. We cannot totally disengaging from anything, any responsibility, we have to manage it, we have to engage it, we have to. So I think in this particular case also, with MCC, of course, I think the US also understands, there is a new government in power, and that government is a democratically elected government which had a massive, percentage of the vote. So that government in the local context is responsible for that particular voice. So if there is a feeling that, MCC is not the best option at the moment, that the mechanisms of the Millennium Challenge Corporation operation, the way of how it sets up operation within the governing apparatus, whether that harms or not, whether the land registration is a problem, whether building of the land, why is Trincomalee? There are a lot of questions about that, because Trincomalee is very important to us. Why would the MCC kind of create a clear path from Trincomalee to Mana? Is that a kind of connecting to? I mean, these are all the questions people have asking. Is the US and India trying to tie up on something? There are these questions. So I think, any agreement and even the former government, the Good Governance government, which had a great relationship with India, I think a lot of people forget, canceled the Sampur power project. And also, they effectively said no to SEPA, the discussions that were going on for a trade, agreement with India. So the governments have to take domestically, because at the end of it, still governments are domestically very responsible when you are democratically elected. If you're undemocratic, then it's not a problem. So if countries want to tell us to be democracies, we also have to respect the democratic, the system that those governments came to power. So I think MCC was the MCC was a challenge, and MCC and that was the dominant thinking. So I think that is probably why the government pulled out of it. That doesn't mean it's going to go for a tail end, because for United States also, because of its Indo-Pacific ambitions, as many people have asked this question, the US also to a certain extent needs Sri Lanka. So we understand that. So that doesn't mean, so this is not a time, complexity is not a time when you make clear-cut enemies. You might not have clear-cut friends. That the advantage is you don't have clear-cut enemies as well. That is why even a lot of these doctrines are saying the conflict zones are gray, huh? No more black and white. So it's gray. So sometimes the gray is advantageous, probably for countries like us. So I don't want to hold ourselves hostage to fortune here, but I'm telling people, these are real questions. But these are the real deal. The real answers are the most honest answer I can give at this particular moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Lonely Planet magazine published in 2019, Sri Lanka is #1 country for tourism. But after Easter Sunday attack, the industry went down. However, government reboots the industry, but again, COVID-19 affected the industry badly. There is a gap between the current government practices and minority attitudes. The United States has also shown their concern in the Easter attack by the terrorists. So based on this situation, how Sri Lanka can mitigate internal security and minority threat by the minorities?
Yeah. So I think those are two different ideas in one question. But yeah, I think being a Sri Lankan and being a country which is always welcoming guests, it's a country which thrives on when we talk about the hub. If you just think of the softer side of the hub, we've been so much talking about the strategic aspect of the hub. Our soft power of Sri Lanka, we have to actually, the soft power of Sri Lanka is pretty much this whole allure of the country and our impeccable tourism industry. I think that was pretty much damaged by Easter, and then it got the double blow of COVID-19. So we have I feel, I feel for them. I feel for my friends. I feel for the people in this country who are really struggling, who had made a good living, who had brought a lot of money, who had brought a lot of contribution to Sri Lanka's economy is struggling. So uh, I think we managed to fix the image of Easter Sunday attacks to a certain extent. I think we have managed to bring back a sense of security. There, the last time I remember, I was checking with some of my friends in the industry, the numbers were going up. But as the numbers were kind of taking a ascent, we were hit by COVID-19. So, I mean, this is a struggle for us. But still, Sri Lanka remains one of those, we are still not, of course, there is outbreak is there. Our death rates are quite low. Our infection rates are still pretty, comparatively low, and the severity rate is really low, right? Most Sri Lankans who are affected are asymptomatic, right? Which is scary as well. It's like a zombie movie, but we most of people don't show symptoms. So it doesn't have the chaos, and it doesn't have that kind of public health breakdown. Thanks to our public health system, thanks to a serious government response backed by the military health services. It was one of the best efforts you can see they have managed. But I think rescuing the tourism industry is a bit of a different conversation. I'm no expert in tourism, but I think what they're trying at the moment is they're trying to introduce travel bubbles. So you have designated zones and resorts and points where tourists can come and stay, and will not be exposed to any Sri Lanka locals. Neither the locals will be exposed to tourists. So they're experimenting with the travel bubble system. But I think it's not a Sri Lanka's only problem. I think with the downturn of the global travel industry, airline industry, the downturn with economy, people's spending powers really going down, we are in for a very hard time. I think still Sri Lankan local tourism now depends heavily on local tourists, Sri Lankan tourism. I think the government also should look at promoting that and supporting that in a bit of a big way, where at least because to kind of find the right mix, and also to see if we can get some of our largest tourist numbers came from India. Actually, Indians were the India and China. Apart from the European destinations, I think India and China, Indians particularly. So if Sri Lanka can go into, I think Minister Jaishankar had this conversation. If we can at least look at, but again for Sri Lanka, if you look at from a COVID-19 point of view, which India is very much affected. It has more than 10 million, rate of affection. So we are, I think we are sensitive about that as well. So we have to look at destinations. We have to create, I think, bilaterals when it comes to travel bubbles have to be bilaterals. So that's the way forward. But I'm no expert on tourism, so I don't want to kind of talk on things I'm not very well versed in.
Thank you, sir. Let me move to the next question. Like during the last 26 years armed conflicts, the LTT was responsible for countless grave abuses, including unlawful killing and attack on civilians. 11 years since the end of the civil war, what efforts has the government made in providing accountability and reconciliation to the victims? And there's another question, what challenges do internally displaced people face? What is their status?
Yeah, I think for both questions, all Sri Lankan governments since the end of the war, I mean, this is, I think, again, a work in progress. I'm not trying to say everything is great, but all governments have tried, one has done their best to provide, to bring people back into normalcy, their lives. But one of the actual challenges, if you look at in Sri Lanka, when it comes to dealing with accountability and all these things, is the fact that we have made certain, the 2009, after 2009, there was a very important commission established by the government. It was called the LLRC, the Lesson Learned Commission, which included senior public servants, academics, and they came out with real solid recommendations on how to move forward. I think some of these recommendations were not taken. So as a result, I think we are facing serious problems from human rights, external pressures. For example, the human rights pressure, and then also our certain government. I know there were certain blunders. For example, the fact that we went into co-sponsoring a resolution, I think was a problem. I mean, and at the same time, the problem is if we had enacted a local mechanism of accountability, and justice, there would have been no issue of would have no issue would have come up of creating external, mechanisms to provide justice and to create just yeah. So I think a few parts of it. So reconstruction and bringing people's livelihoods back, I think that has been quite successful. So if people in Sri Lanka know, if you go to former conflict zones, there is, you can see the return to normalcy to a certain extent. But I think the problem, there are certain problems. One is, I think, still the north and east war affected areas, youth still needs to be provided more livelihood, opportunities to professional jobs. That is still not, adequate enough. So you can see still certain level of youth unrest. And also, I think the political parties which are representing the north and east have uh, kind of gone on again the communal racial path, and they have managed, I mean, as a convenience of getting votes and running election, uh, they have kind of brought back the mantra of not separatism, but to a certain extent extreme nationalism. So it's not helping. So at certain levels, and the military is now drawing back, military is drawing down, military is trying to stay away. There is more and more civilian, normalcy of civilian establishment, civilian role being put up. But there has been a big demand that the military should totally vacate. But I think if you look from a security perspective, you know that it's very difficult for the military to totally give up positions and totally vacate. You can't just shut shop and move. But the military is trying to be more invincible, to kind of move away from public limelight and try to do it. But I think it's still three issues. The whole reconciliation, transitional justice processes could be improved, but it has to be fair across the board. I mean, you can't have the LTT, as said, as they pointed right. LTT has committed vast amount of atrocities against non-combatants, as well as unarmed combatants. There are cases of virtual assassinations and killings of, for example, 800 policemen who are unarmed. So they were not unarmed, they were not combatants. And then in a certain military establishment that they LTT ran, I think probably these are the largest number of service personnel killed after the Second World War. They were totally massacred. So LTT has come in and committed so much of war crimes as well. So I think that's a work in progress. But what has happened tangibly is the fact that there is, if you visit those areas, you will see the difference. But that doesn't mean everything is normal. One is, I feel that most of the youth who are post-war, I mean, they were maybe 10, 12 years old, but now they are in the age of 18, 20 plus. These guys need to be brought into the mainstream. They need jobs. They need a decent, lifestyle, livelihood. If that fails, we will have another problem in our hands in the future. So that is a policy set of policy challenges the government has to deal with. And also how to manage communal politicians. I mean, that's a bit of another challenge. The Sri Lankan state has, but we are a democratic country. If you don't like politicians, if you don't like minorities, you can't just go and take them out. Still, we are a democracy, so we have to value that. Even if it's extreme in opinion, they are still in political. Politics. It's democratic politics. So in a way, we can say that is what it's. It's a democracy. We have to preserve our form as a democracy.
Dr. Harinda Bidanage, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. We still have more than 30 questions, but we have come to the end. We have to end it here. We wish to invite you again in future, maybe in real, once the situation gets normal. Thank you very much for your time, sir. We'd also like to thank all our participants for the interesting question. We'd like to request you all to join our next event tomorrow, which is on the attack on the US Congress, challenges for Biden administration. See you tomorrow. Take care and stay safe. Good night.
Thank you, Pramod. Thank you, everybody, for the questions and participation.